For our penultimate presentation, we are pleased to welcome Bev Eyre to speak about Before the Act, a seminal movement in LGBTQ plus history when stars of theatre and music came together to stand against Section 28. Section 28 stated that a local authority shall not intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, or even promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended relationship. Bev's presentation is the first in a series of podcasts, the other episodes of which we will link in the chat below. You can interact in the chat, and Bev will be answering questions after the presentation, so you can put those in the Q&A box if you would like them to be answered.
Hello, you're listening to Before the Act, a series of podcasts about a groundbreaking moment in theatre and social history, as told by some of the wonderful women who were there. These podcasts were made during the coronavirus lockdown, and I caught up with people I haven't spoken to in 30 years on the phone.
Hello.
Hello, is that Katrina?
Yes, Bev, how are
Is that
you?
Karen?
It is.
Is that Cyan?
Yes, it is. Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. They all have one thing in common. They witnessed and participated in the start of the fight against the notorious Section 28 and the founding of Stonewall, the organisation that would spend 15 years lobbying for its repeal. I recorded their personal memories alongside radio interviews and audio clips of real events. Our story is set in the summer of 1988. It's 7 p.m. on June the 5th. We're standing outside the Piccadilly Theatre in Denman Street in London's West End. There's the usual theatre crowd gathered and a group of beautiful men in dinner jackets and bow ties, middle-aged women wearing posh frocks, and some boyish lesbians and camp young lads holding tickets which are now changing hands for 5 times their face value. The theatre doors have just opened and the audience are jostling their way into the foyer. Inside the auditorium, the stage is set to showcase a cast of over 100 performers. Lights have been focused and sound levels set during the day. A grand piano, sofa and chairs and a park bench are waiting in the wings to be set by an all-female crew. Huge speakers are piled high on either side of the stage. A Nobel laureate, a dame, a baroness, legendary theatre actors, BAFTA and Oscar winners are all cramped backstage alongside young drama students and alternative cabaret stars. A world-famous conductor and a cellist are sharing a dressing room with a world-famous opera singer. Next door is the cast of EastEnders and Brookside, and next door to them an all-women jazz band and a well-loved TV detective. The atmosphere is exciting and terrifying, particularly for 2 young pop stars about to play their first ever live performance, unaware that they'll be awarded a Brit 21 years later. It's been a long day, and it's about to be one of the most significant but largely forgotten nights in LGBT history. I'm Bev Eyre, one of the stage managers of Before the Act, the show that 1,200 people are piling into the Piccadilly to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because our story really starts back in January of 1988. I was sitting in a flat above an off-licence in Sidcup, Kent, listening to Third Ear, an arts programme on Radio 3.
The House of Lords has just begun the committee stage of its discussion of the 1988 Local Government Bill. Not at first an issue of pressing interest to people in the arts, but Clause 28 of the bill, added during the committee stage in the House of Commons, has set alarm bells ringing among people in the theatre, the visual arts, the cinema, music, museums and libraries. As it stands, Clause 28 is intended to make it illegal for local authorities to promote homosexuality or to give money or assistance to anybody who does. An ad hoc arts lobby has been set up to oppose Clause 28. Prominent amongst those who've spoken against the clause is the actor Ian McKellen. So you would just like to see Clause 28 disappear altogether?
Oh, yes, I certainly would, yes. I think it's offensive to anyone who's, like myself, homosexual, apart from the whole business of what can or cannot be taught to children.
In that completely understated way, Ian McKellen had just done the unimaginable and come out on national radio. And I was listening because I'd also come out within a year of being at drama school, along with around a third of my year, who, like me, were running away from home to be themselves. It was an intolerant time. The AIDS crisis was unleashing reactionary press coverage, ignorance and fear, which further fuelled a rise in rampant and state-sanctioned homophobia. The age of consent at the time for gay men was 21. Lesbian mothers had their children routinely taken from them, and 75% of the UK population thought that homosexuality was wrong. And despite homosexuality being decriminalised in 1967, gay men were spied on and trapped into importuning with undercover police officers, meaning the number of gay men convicted of same-sex behaviour in 1988 was almost the same as in 1955. There was still a huge cultural battle to be won. Third year again.
21 years after the passage of the Liberalising Sexual Offences Act, is there now a greater, not lesser, intolerance towards homosexuals? In a signed editorial for the Sunday Telegraph, the newspaper's editor, Peregrine Worsthorne, has suggested that there is. But, argues Mr. Worsthorne, responsibility for this renewed intolerance lies with those of liberal persuasion, and indeed with homosexuals themselves, who, he writes, have become a bold and brazen proselytising cult.
I think the basic feeling of perhaps the majority of the British people is that it was quite wrong to persecute homosexuals, and that should stop in a civilized society. I think that as a result of the toleration, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the faction of the homosexual community have seen fit, and I think very mistakenly, to say not only must this activity be permitted and tolerated, but it must actually be glorified and said to be certainly the equal of the heterosexual life, if not the superior. And I think this is a deplorably ill-advised, because I think that it was likely to, and I think it probably has, created a feeling of ill will against homosexuality, which would otherwise never have existed.
This ill will, and the idea that homosexuality could be promoted, was at the core of Section 28. On the programme, McKellen challenged Peregrine Worsthorne, who responds by summing up much of conservative England's fears.
I would have to challenge you to quote the medical authority which supports you in assuming that people can be pushed into homosexuality and as a teenager, or indeed pushed into heterosexuality. It didn't work with me. I wasn't pushed into heterosexuality, and you clearly have not been pushed into homosexuality.
Ian McKellen,
you must tell me what is your basis for believing that?
I will answer the question. I went to an English boarding school where homosexuality, perhaps faute de mieux, was very much a practice, and it was touch and go, I think, with a number of people, whether they continued to be homosexual or ceased, and that this could be very much affected by a glamorous master, by particular teaching. I mean, I do think that you can be affected in this way.
It was clearly touch and go for Peregrine, who went on to say that he regarded homosexuality as a great misfortune, and I remember being struck by what a truly remarkable thing Ian McKellen had just done. Few people came out voluntarily in the 1980s. They were usually exposed and persecuted by the media. Rock Hudson, although suspected of being gay, wasn't publicly outed until 1985, when it was revealed that he was suffering from HIV. David Bowie and Boy George had flamboyantly declared their homosexuality, but there were few out mainstream lesbians. Dusty Springfield was in the closet, and it took until 1988 for Elton John to come out publicly. George Michael would only follow suit a further 10 years later. It was a very brave and potentially career-changing admission for Ian McKellen to make. you didn't have to look far to see why he would take such a risk. At the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool in October 1987, Margaret Thatcher spelt out her education plans.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
Section 28 was the first piece of new homophobic legislation in 100 years. It was met with uproar from LGBT activists. In February of 1988, 3 lesbian protesters abseiled from the public gallery of the House of Lords, a spectacular sight that made national headlines.
3 women gay rights protesters caused pandemonium in the House of Lords when they abseiled from the public gallery onto the floor of the chamber. Black Rod and his staff quickly seized the demonstrators and escorted them out. The women were protesting that the Lords had approved a clause banning local councils from promoting homosexuality.
We waited till the vote went through so that in no way were we going to change anybody's minds. We did the respectable bit and sat in there and listened to it, and then they legislated against us, so we thought, well, we'll just shake them up a bit. And maybe make them think
Actually, if you went in there with a rope, you didn't think, we'll shake them up a bit. You went in there intending to do it all the time.
No, we weren't going to do it.
You just took a rope just for fun, just in case.
If the vote was on our side, we were going to walk out.
Later that year, lesbian Avengers went on to storm the BBC studios and chain themselves to newsreader Sue Lawley's desk, disrupting the 6 o'clock news.
As the titles for the BBC's 6 o'clock news came on air this evening, 2 of the 4 women who invaded Television Centre burst into the studio. One chained herself to a remotely operated camera, the other to the desk where presenter Sue Lawley was introducing the news.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge to the poll tax. Tory rebels have said that the tax
As the
is
headlines
unfair.
continued, presenter Nicholas Witchell sat on one of the women and put his hand over her mouth to muffle her protests. Senior television news executives rushed in with a hacksaw to remove the women's handcuffs. As all that was going on, Sue Lawley was left to apologise to viewers.
And I do apologise if you're hearing quite a lot of noise in this studio at the moment. I'm afraid that we have rather been invaded by some people who we hope to be removing very shortly. In the meantime, if you can possibly ignore the background news, we'll bring the news as best we can.
The women were taken to Shepherd's Bush police station but were later released without being charged. They said they were protesting against Clause 28 of the local government bill and were able to walk through Television Centre unchallenged.
In Manchester, more than 20,000 people marched and attended a rally with speeches and music from Ian McKellen, Michael Cashman, Erasure and Tom Robinson.
The British police are the best in the world. I don't believe one of these stories I've heard about pretty policemen in leather and jeans, showing their leg through a split in the seams, leering at people and leading them on, then running them in when they start to respond. The press will ignore it, they don't want to see, except when the case is a Tory MP. So sing if you're glad to be gay, sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay, sing if you're happy that way.
But what did this have to do with our show at the Piccadilly? Trina Cornwell, one of the founders of 20th Century Vixens, a women's production company, and the producer of Before the Act, explains.
We decided we should maybe do something for the lesbian and gay community, and this was all around Section 28. From that stemmed the fact that we had to buckle down and raise a lot of money to form a group whose sole purpose would be fighting Section 28. There was a meeting called, which ended in chaos, and it was packed, this room. And I remember Wendy kicking it off and saying, you know, this is what we have to do. And people were saying, oh, yes, we'll have a little disco down at so-and-so, and we should be able to raise £5 off that. And Wendy was saying, no, £5 is nothing. You know, we've got to start thinking big.
Wendy and Trina set up 20th Century Vixen in the early 80s, and apart from producing and managing artists, they used to programme the London Lesbian and Gay Centre in Farringdon. At the time, much of the gay scene was separated along gender lines, with women and men-only spaces.
And then there was the whole thing about, it should be women only at the meeting, and the men should go, and then the men were saying it should be men only and they should go. And really, in the end, very little was achieved from that meeting. But it was just before the Lesbian and Gay March in Manchester, and a whole crowd were going up by train to Manchester, and we managed to get the Hot Doris Band, the 4 women, to perform on the train all the way up, just for fun. And it was fun. Michael Cashman was very involved with the lesbian and gay movement.
What I actually want to say, and it's the most important thing we must remember, and I want ordinary men and women to remember, that gay men and lesbians are ordinary men and women made extraordinary by society's focus on what we do in bed. And as ordinary men and women, we demand the same rights, no more, no less, the same rights as other ordinary civilized human beings.
So we made it our mission, if you like, to get hold of Michael off the march, take him somewhere and tell him what we had thought should happen. And he said, this is a really good idea. I think we need to talk to Ian McKellen about it. And so a meeting was arranged with Michael, Ian, Wendy and myself at that point. And it was then decided that we would put on a production in a West End theatre, and that every single thing that was performed had to have been written by a lesbian or a gay man.
Over 35 extracts from plays, poems, songs and sketches from 25 lesbian and gay authors were chosen. When I spoke to Katrina Buchanan from the Hot Doris Band, she recalled Ian McKellen approaching playwright Alan Bennett to allow his work to feature and appear in the show.
No one was entirely sure, because he'd never said one way or the other. And they approached him and asked if they could use some of his work. And the premise of it was that it's by, lesbian, gay, bisexual creators. And Alan Bennett said that, in my time, I've had a little bit of both and not enough of either. Which, if you imagine that, then in Alan Bennett's voice is perfect, isn't it?
Putting a show of this size together on no budget was a mammoth task and took months to prepare. Trina again.
We had numerous meetings, obviously. It took a long time to get together, and it was a nightmare. We got the theatre, insisted that we paid, but it wasn't that expensive. We found a team of stage management so that they would be there to move things. And we had a team of people, lesbian or gay people, who looked after all the artists. It was interesting in that until the day that it actually happened, nothing had been brought together. All over London prior to it were people rehearsing and doing this and doing that. And so bringing it all together was quite incredible.
It was incredible, and so were the cast.
Ian was ringing up sort of in the middle of the night saying things like, I was wondering about whether Imelda Staunton would like to sing the suffragette song at the end of Act One. And we were saying, oh, yes. And then he'd say, Crazy Things, really, everybody that was anybody was on that stage that night.
In the weeks running up to June the 5th, I attended rehearsals all over London. I particularly remember Maria Aikin's house, where she and a young Rupert Everett, Richard Griffiths, James Wilby, Timothy West and Ian Charlson were running through Noel Cowart's Hands Across the Sea. And at Pineapple Dance Studios, Sheila Hancock was entertaining a young Gary Oldman as Mr. Sloane alongside her husband John Thor. It was a logistical nightmare, and one that was put together over weeks, and as Trina says, with the whole show only finally coming together on the day of the performance.
The whole thing just ran like clockwork. I mean, the fact we were dead after it was neither here nor there.
Here's Mandy Short from the Hot Doris Band.
We were four women who sort of did this quite traditional harmony singing, if you like, but we didn't dress like we were supposed to. We made sure that stuff that we sang reflected our own personal politics and the larger politics of the world. My recollection is that Trina and Wendy had booked the Piccadilly Theatre to do this big event. That's my recollection, is it started off as a Wendy and Trina event. We were obviously always going to do it. And then I think several more of the more alternative cabaret people were going to take part in before the act. But it sort of got whittled down because it just got really big and famous.
Let's go back to the Piccadilly Theatre. The Hot Doris Band have spent the day rehearsing in one of the theatre bars. I asked them about getting involved in the show and how it felt on the day. Cyan Kent remembers the atmosphere in the theatre on the morning of the show.
It was like something that happened in a Hollywood film, in a sense, wasn't it? You were just kind of part of something. You knew you were part of something, didn't quite know what it was, but you knew you were part of something. I think it was just rammed backstage with anyone who was anyone again. There were just people all over the place.
I asked Katrina what she remembered about the tech and the dress rehearsal.
I was about 24 and just thinking, I remember thinking, oh, Jen, all right. But I also felt kind of, it was, I had no sense of what that show was like because we did our bit and then it was everyone on, off, get out the fucking way because it was such a colossal show. I did not know. So we finish, curtain comes down, and we've been the warm-up act for Tom Stopper.
Karen Parker, part of comedy duo Parker and Klein, was also sitting in the auditorium watching the day's events.
In the sound check, I just remember the Pet Shop Boys, they had all these speakers sort of in the actual auditorium, and the loudness of that, and they were really nervous because I think it was their first live gig they did, I think. Being in the lift with Stephen Fry because he was introducing us, and he was so nervous. We kind of got there for our sound check and then we stayed because I remember making my hair get bigger and bigger and bigger. Like with curlers. Everyone had curlers in and things like that. I just remember seeing all these really famous people walking around with hair rollers in and terribly nervous. And I just thought, I need to get my hair bigger.
It's now 7:25 p.m. on June the 5th, 1988. The house lights are dimming and Michael Cashman, nervously waiting in the wings, is about to make his entrance onto the stage of the Piccadilly. He will introduce before the act and the first performers, the Hot Doris Band. Ladies and gentlemen, take your seats. Tonight's performance is about to begin. This podcast was created by Bev Eyre, Tim Brunston and Lou Muddle, with the kind help and generous support of Trina Cornwell, Cyan Kent, Katrina Buchanan, Mandy Short, Karen Parker and Angie West of Queer Bee Films. Before the Act was a benefit show to counter the effects of Section 28. It was devised by Michael Cashman, Sean Mathias, Ian McKellen, Stephen Oliver and Martin Sherman. It was produced by 20th Century Vixen Promotions. Hello, you're listening to Before the Act, a series of podcasts about a groundbreaking moment in theatre and social history, as told by some of the wonderful women who were there. These podcasts were made during the coronavirus lockdown, and I caught up with people I haven't spoken to in 30 years on the phone.
Hello.
Hello, is that Katrina?
Yes, Bev, how the hell are you?
One question at the moment, so if anyone has any more, please pop them in the Q&A box. And somebody asks, do you think such an event could happen today, or has the LGBTQ plus community become more fragmented since then?
Well, funnily enough, for 11 years I ran Homotopia, which is the country's largest LGBT arts festival. So I certainly think it's entirely possible that we used to do 58 events every year, LGBTQ events, and it's still running, and we worked abroad and, you know, internationally. So yeah, I'm sure it could. We need something to unite against, I think. I think that's the key thing is, you know, Section 28 really did galvanise people. That year was an incredible year. You know, started in 1987 when the Tory party conference, when Margaret Thatcher gave that inalienable rights speech. And then from that year, you had the lesbians abseil into Parliament in February, the Manchester March, again, was in February. Then the lesbian abseil is on May the 24th. And then, you know, June the 5th was before the Act. So that year was a really galvanating year. So I think if you've got a strong enough cause, yeah, I think you could.
We have another question. You mentioned the difficulty of approaching Alan Bennett as he wasn't out at the time. Was that a challenge with other celebrities?
Well, it was a challenge with everybody because nobody was out. I mean, when you hear about Ian McKellen coming out on radio, it was absolutely groundbreaking because although one of the reasons a lot of us worked in the theatre or went to drama school is so we could be out amongst our friends and in the theatre, but very, very few people were out. And one of the reasons gay and lesbian performers were allowed to felt confident enough to take part in the show was that they were alongside a lot of other mainstream performers that nobody had raised any questions over their sexuality. So you didn't know who on that stage was necessarily out or who was straight or although about 4 people actually came out on the night in support of Ian McKellen and in support of of the cause.
That's really amazing, actually. I don't think we have any more questions currently. Here's one. Do you think that the AIDS crisis helped to unite the community?
Well, if you listen to the second programme and the third programme, Katrina talks a lot about that because we all worked on the cabaret circuit as well. And at one point in 1988, we were probably going to 100 funerals over the course of that year, and they were people that previously, gay men predominantly, that had we'd been working with. They'd been booking us as stage managers or as performers, or so it was an incredible and traumatizing time, and it did galvanise people. And what particularly galvanised people was the response of the media to it. The media really did whip a lot of fear into people, and there was a huge amount of prejudice, and I do think that played a role in uniting the theatre community against Section 28. Yeah, I think it's a really good question.
We have linked the second and third episodes of the podcast in the chat if anybody wants to listen to them. I think that's it. Oh, one more. What is your favourite memory of the event?
Gosh, it was a long time ago now. I would say it was just absolutely incredible. I was 25. It was probably I'd left drama school the year before, and I was working for Gay Sweatshop and for the Women's Theatre Group. There were lots and lots of political theatre companies around at the time. And then to do something like that was just massive. It was really exciting. I really liked the rehearsal period because we were going to people's homes and they were the most famous people that that you could think of at the time. But I think on the day, probably the most amazing thing was when the Pet Shop Boys played. It was they'd never played live before,
And either side of the stage, we had these massive speakers, and we put them on straight after the interval because we just had a stage full of computer equipment, and it was a huge setup. And they were so nervous. I mean, they were absolutely terrified. And they were going to play a song called It Couldn't Happen Here, but they changed their mind on the day and they played It's a Sin. And everybody in the theatre went absolutely insane.
Bethan asks, was there any traction or publicity about the event at all, especially outside the LGBT plus community? It's a really interesting and radical kind of event for its time.
Yeah, I mean, it was in things like God, you won't know them. You're probably all too young, but there were things like London magazines that were out at the time, and it was reviewed. There is a review of the show, which I'm going to put up on the website. But it wasn't massively promoted because it sold out within days. Just in terms of, I mean, the cast was incredible. They were, Oscar winners. There were people who, had BAFTA winners. We had dames, we had sirs, we had, it was the most famous people you could think of. Tilda Swinton, lots of young actors that were starting out. Stephen Fry, the great playwrights of the time came. So, we didn't need to promote it to sell it as a show. What it did do, which the second and third things go on to, is it taught us how to raise money. It taught the group how to raise money. And we did Bent the following year, the Martin Sherman play, in another West End theatre. And the money that we raised founded Stonewall and paid for the first chief executive of Stonewall. And of course, 15 years later, I went on to work for Stonewall as development director. And I was there when Section 28 was repealed. So the whole story sort of comes full circle, which is very strange.
Somebody has asked, do you think the TV series captured the feel of the 1980s in London? And I'm going to assume that's probably a question about It's a Sin.
I really like It's a Sin, and I think it's brilliant that it's been made, but I do have a criticism of it. It's not London in the 1980s. No, it was filmed in Manchester, and it looks like Manchester. And what it doesn't portray, and it can't portray everything, so I'm not criticising it in that respect. But what it doesn't portray are places like the Bell, which were really mixed. I was a young lesbian in my 20s, loads of gay guys. We used to go there, we all used to dress the same. We all had flat tops and check shirts and Dr. Martin boots. And it doesn't portray that sort of scene. It doesn't really show the leather queens and the clones that were around, which were massive on the scene at the time. Lots and lots of men dressed in leather with moustaches and chains. And but it can't do it can't do everything. It's just one TV program, so I don't criticize it as a program. But if there's something that I don't think was right about it, it's the art direction and that sort of positioning of it. It's slightly not the 1980s for me.
We've got somebody asking, why do you think Beyond the Act is overlooked in LGBT history, as it was clearly a massive event?
I think LGBT history is overlooked. So I don't. Nobody really recorded things at the time. So I've done lots of work in the past. I did an exhibition on April Ashley at the Liverpool Museum. April was the 7th person in the world to transition, and she was a Vogue model. And a million people came to see that exhibition over the course of a year. But prior to that, I'd be surprised if any of you young people know who April is still. A lot of LGBT history wasn't recorded at the time and is overlooked. And even when I went to work for Stonewall in 2002, Stonewall didn't know about Before the Act, and the fact that even though Ian was still a part of it and, very much involved and still is, they didn't know where Stonewall had come from in that.
Anybody who was watching the event earlier, April was mentioned as part of the Trans Lives in Britain event in the kind of at noon today. There are no more questions, but Sue says, thank you so much. It really took me down memory lane. And I think we can only kind of reiterate that statement. Thank you so much for for a really wonderful and informative talk. It was so great to find out more about such an overlooked piece of LGBT history, especially when it's as important as this.
Do any of you, because I can't see any of your faces, but do any of you remember the time, or you know, what are your feelings hearing it now in retrospect? If you're younger, you know, what does it feel like to you? Do you feel you've got more freedom now? And
well, I don't think any of us were actually educated under Section 28, although I think we've definitely felt the impact of it past that with sort of a lack of education. But I think it's a lot easier to be more open now. I think there's a lot of, Bethan thinks she might have been under Section 28. There's definitely a lot more openness and freedom and a lot more people experimenting with labels. And I think it creates a more safe atmosphere to be out.
So you feel that you're luckier now, because that makes it sort of worthwhile in a way. Because I know Sue was and still is a huge activist in terms of challenging Section 28. So I suppose it means, you know, we did, you know, it worked, you know, in some ways.
Thanks, Bev. I mean, it was just wonderful to hear the story again, and it just took me way back to those extraordinary times. So bless you, and it just made me realise I couldn't do all that creative stuff because I had my head down trying to sort out the Lords and various other things. But I just think the creativity of the LGBT community just comes out so fully in your piece, and I just always constantly am so thrilled at how wicked and amazing and creative we are when we have to face oppression, and we still are. If you look at the LGBT History Month calendar, it's full of really exciting stuff. Today has been brilliant, and it's been wonderful to hear the youngsters and amazing stuff, and Ju Gosling's piece was really challenging. So bless you, Bev. Thank you so much for making sure that we don't forget and we remember our history, because it's so important.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it was very creative, but also, you know, it's very clever because it set in stone a sort of a method of raising money that by the time I got to Stonewall, we were making 300,000 from the Equality Dinner, and the money that we were raising was challenging the government in court. That's what that's what Angela Mason was using it for. So you can use the arts in a way that enriches everybody's lives, but you can also use it in a really practical way to galvanize people, make money, and make change.
Positive change.
Positive change. And that's what I think, and it's not me, I was the stage manager, but that's what I really believe that group did. Lisa Power and Trina and Wendy and Ian McKellen and Cashman, and, you know, they were incredibly clever the way they went about it.
And the Drill Hall was where we all met and did the work. So the Drill Hall was another incredibly important place around theatre and culture. Julie Parker and Mavis Seaman did so much amazing stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the arts lobby was much wider, wasn't it? You know,
yeah.
Much wider. And isn't it great when artists come out against things? You know, they're so powerful.
It is.
So thank you so much. It's really nice to take part.
We've got a few people saying things in the chat. Joshua says that he grew up in South Africa where it was dangerous and he feels so much safer here. It's easy to forget how far we've come. Ian says it's been argued that Section 28 was a massive own goal for the Tories to see how many people came out as a result. Melissa says the fear in teachers is still very present. Local brave teachers have come to THC's written primary LGBT history workshops, and they had to fight to be able to bring their pupils.
It does. It still resonates now, doesn't it? It really does still resonate now. And I know what you mean about, you know, feeling in danger. It was routine when I was in my early 20s for young, particularly young gay male friends of mine, to be what was commonly called queer bashed at the time. That was something that you just expected would happen, which is a terrible thing to say, but you weren't surprised. And I think there's still a lot of hate crime around now, but I do think it's a lot better. And I do think that the police forces have dealt with things a lot better. I've done a lot of work with Merseyside Police, who've really paved the way, I think, for a lot of quite groundbreaking work in terms of LGBT hate crime rights and awareness.
Well, as Joshua says, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and thank you so much for sharing your story. Nick says, yes, absolutely. There's still such a hangover from this era as teachers and parents were educated during it. I run LGBTQ youth groups and deliver SOGI and RSE training in schools. We've come so far, but we still have a long way to go too.
We do. About 10 years ago, I took a group of 10 young LGBT teenagers, they were 16, to Poland, took them to Auschwitz, and then introduced them to a Polish group of LGBT people who were challenging the Polish government, which is, still very frightening over in Poland. And there's a resource called Project Triangle that we made, which is online, which is a film about their experiences. If you ever want to watch it, I'd be interested to see how you think we've changed from their experience, because they were very much living with the backlash of Section 28. And I think, as you're saying, I think it's probably still just as strong nowadays, just not as overt.
Thank you. I believe that's it. There's no more questions. So once again, thank you so much for coming here, giving this talk and telling us all about what is clearly such an amazing and partially forgotten part of LGBT history.
Thank you very much for having me.